Welcome to Strength for Today's Pastor, conversations with current senior pastors and leaders which will strengthen and help you in your pastoral ministry. And now, here's your host, Bill Holdridge of Poiman Ministries.
Welcome to podcast number 95. And again, we're happy to have as our guest, pastor, author, speaker, Gayle Erwin, as we talk about what Gayle has called the one string on his guitar, which is, of course, the nature of Jesus Christ and what that means for the way we live and the way we serve. Gayle's the founder of Servant Quarters and has traveled literally millions of miles to tell pastors and congregations and leaders about the real Jesus. And in his book, The Jesus Style, which has sold over 500,000 copies, been translated into a number of languages, he has continued to play that string. So welcome back to the program, Gayle. We're really glad to have you. I'm excited about this.
I'm honored that you're having me. I'm excited, too.
Oh, good. Well, you know we're going to be talking about Jesus as he's actually described in the New Testament and as you've written and preached about for so many years. And in the foreword to the book, The Jesus Style, former U.S. Senate chaplain Richard Halverson wrote that the main issue, the critical issue in the church is what we believe about Jesus Christ. So you've been a pastor for many, many years. I've been a pastor for a while, since 1976. But I know that speaking for myself, way too often I've missed the point about Jesus and missed the point about Jesus in my own life and in the way I do ministry. And, you know, sometimes I think, well, I know him pretty well, and then I discover not so much at all. But I have to say that I've rediscovered lately the Jesus Style. I've been listening to your recording of its reading. You did the actual recording of the reading
Yes.
of the book. And my wife and I have been following along with the text and then listening to the audio. And it's been amazing. It's been encouraging. It's been challenging. And I have to say life-changing. So I thank you for that. So my question is, why should pastors in relationship to their own walks with the Lord and in relationship to their ministries be thinking about Jesus and his nature as the main thing? Why is that important?
Well, I think because it's important in the Bible. In him was the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and he came to fully reveal God to us and to walk with us and teach us what it meant to live for him. Now, my upbringing, I was in a Pentecostal denomination, and I was used to being drug over the fire every week, and nobody really seemed to understand what the nature of Jesus was. I remember one time, my father, who was a preacher, I was just about, 3 or 4 years old, and he was up in the sanctuary praying, and he had the Bible in his hand, and he had his finger on something, walking back and forth, saying, "What does this mean? What does this mean?" Later, I asked him, "What verse was that?" And it was a verse that says, "Who, though he was God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God." And I thought, wow, that's something that God's especially revealed to me, that he used no force in doing what he was doing. And I'm thinking, what an early point that came in my life. But then, as I don't know if you know or not, but my father was severely injured in an airplane accident that left him with brain damage and left side paralyzed. And I had to become his valet. He was still a person, Mom had to make the living, and that meant we lived in poverty until I got off in college. And so I had to travel with my dad and take care of him. And I learned a lot about what it meant to serve and to think in his behalf and so forth. So it was an interesting experience for me to hear all of the messages that I had, and a good preacher would just drag you over the fire in those Pentecostal denomination. and make you sure you were a sinner again so you could possibly get saved all over again, because that's what he counted on. And I was going to tell you how a certain preacher was related to me, but I won't. But he is good at that, you know. And I thought, when I visited him, I asked him after he was older, and I said, "How is it going?" He said, "I've never felt more of a failure in all my life." And I thought, how sad, because he was that kind of drag him over the fire preacher. And ultimately people leave you. Anyway, when I discovered, hey, it's really all about Jesus, isn't it? In him was the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And so when I observed his life, it wasn't a God's gonna get you kind of thing. His main friends were sinners and poorer people. And the Pharisees, who were like the Republicans of today, and the Sadducees like our Democrats, they thought that you were poor because you were a sinner. And so they, of course, were rich. You had to be rich to be a Pharisee. Otherwise, they would tell you, you can't be one because God doesn't like you. At any rate, all of this began to come together, and I saw that Jesus was awfully kind with people. He hung around sinners. That's the thing that the Pharisees would blame him for. And he exampled servanthood. He was the one truly others-centered person, And so I began to examine his nature, and I found out that servant was number one. He was totally centered on other people. He didn't have to boast. He just, wherever there was a need, he was there. And it's amazing that you see him in his miracles, healing people and doing for them what others cannot or would not do. And the guy who was by the pool of Siloam, and had been there for a long, long time. I'm sure Jesus must have known that. And he said, "I have no one to help me in." And Jesus said, "Well, why don't we solve the whole problem?" And now you don't need anybody to put you in. Anyway, the more I studied what I saw in Jesus, I had to come up with the fact that the thing, first of all, was he came to serve, not to be served. That's what he said. I didn't come to be served. Now that just struck me right straight in the face. What do you mean? Talk about serving you. No. I want you to serve others like I do. And that'll be serving me plenty. That'll be obeying me. In fact, in Matthew chapter 22, it says when the Pharisees saw that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they got together, and one of them, a lawyer, tested him, asked him a question. What's the greatest commandment in the law? Now, that's kind of a stupid question, because a good home would repeat that commandment every morning, the great Shema. And Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." He says that's the first and great commandment. And the second, which was not, by the way, in the 10 Commandments, but in the law, is just like it. He elevated it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he said, then on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. In other words, that's what the Bible is all about. That's what they call the Bible, the law and the prophets. And he said, the law and the prophets hang on these 2 things. Love God with everything you got. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he defined love. Well, of course, the Bible also reveals to us the nature of the Father in Exodus, where Moses got to hear this incredible thing. The compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in mercy and faithfulness, mercy to thousands, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. And so this is the way God is. And Jesus when he came in the name of the Lord, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, that meant he was living up to the very nature of the Father in his walk with us. So when I began to see all of this and the whole thing that he tried to teach the apostles was servanthood, but they fought constantly over which of them was the greatest. And Jesus, I would have fired him after a month.
Right.
But right down to the very end, I mean, to that time when he introduced what we call communion, right down to the very end, they were arguing again over who was the greatest. Jesus must have gotten tired of that. And I'm sure each of them got tired of it. And as a preacher, I would get tired of people repeating the same sin over and over if I were a pastor again. But Jesus just didn't do that. He did, at that table, the lowest job. We don't understand foot washing, and this is why some pastors that try to say we're going to have a foot washing service, and maybe 2 or 3 people will show up, but they'll have the cleanest feet they've had in centuries.
Right.
And so they considered the bottom of the foot to be the dirtiest part of the body. And it was only a slave or a person of low estate that would ever wash feet. And if I came into your house as a guest, the first thing you would do is have my feet washed, and you'd anoint my head with oil, which is a nice thing, because when you left, everybody knew somebody liked you. And so the first thing to happen at a meal of this sort would be somebody's all the feet had to be washed, and they weren't going to do it. So Jesus gets up and does the very lowest job on the face of the earth. He took the slave's position because it was for their good. This is just the way he was. And so he taught them, and they still had such trouble understanding. And then he says the most interesting thing. He says, now, a new commandment I give you. And I personally believe that was the commandment now to replace all other commandments. That you love one another as I have loved you. How had he loved them? He had just served them in the lowest job. Well, this was his nature. This was the very nature of Jesus. All of my life, I had never heard that. Until finally, it was, guess who? It was a college girl that I was doing a retreat for some colleges that I had helped them have their organizations, and they had grown, and they wanted to have a retreat with me before they all graduated. And I started to talk about Christian. Well, one of the ladies that was there said, I give people permission to interrupt me, said, you keep using the term Christian leadership. I don't know what that is. How's it different from anything else? And I said, well, if we're going to get leadership from Jesus, let's look at how he led. And I turned to that was a chalkboard day. Turned to the chalkboard, and another young lady said, would his greatest in the kingdom teachings help? And suddenly, I mean, I almost heard angels, man. My whole body began to vibrate. And I laid on that board, the things that Jesus did that were his nature. And that's how my book began. And that was a long time ago. That has been what I want to preach from then on. If you can know Christ, then it solves everything else.
That's amazing. That's such a great introduction to what we're talking about. I love that. Well, in that foreword that Chaplain Halverson wrote for you in the book, he went on to say that the first heresy in the church wasn't to deny the deity of Jesus Christ, but mostly his humanity. And then he said that in the first third of the 20th century, the controversy was about Christ's divinity, which is obviously a huge point of theology. But then he goes on to say, quote, in their justifiable preoccupation with the deity of Christ, evangelicals somehow seem to lose their sense of the humanity of Jesus. In doing so, for all practical purposes, they abandoned the human model which God sent into history to show us not only what God is like, but humanness as God intended it. So what did Chaplain Halverson mean by that statement, and how do we pastors, how have we abandoned what true humanness is like as God intended it in Christ?
Well, we have abandoned it in one way by thinking that being a pastor, we're more spiritual than anyone else, when actually we should be bigger servants than anyone else. And the early church didn't have buildings. They went and they met in homes and virtually conquered the world that way. And it wasn't for about 300 years before we adopted the Greek theater, where you have the skilled performer on the stage and everybody else is merely an observer. And nobody could be observers in the early church. You were deeply involved with everything. It was a really interesting thing. As after the book came out, I was invited to be a part of a group that I was amazed at who they were. They had people's phone numbers that I never even dreamed I'd meet. They were significant individuals. And it was called I've even forgotten what the name was, but their goal was to make servants out of institutions. And I told them, you can't do it. Institutions are formed for self-preservation and never for the preservation of others. And I said, you can't reform them once they're formed. And in some ways, that's the way churches are formed when we build them like the Greek theater style. And of course, you want to make them big and good looking so people will be attracted to it. And you better have a good preacher up front or they aren't going to be coming anymore. So all of the real life is right there in the pulpit, and the people out there don't do anything but listen, which is unfortunate. Of course, there are some exceptions, but not enough.
Yeah, I know a lot of pastors that have actually refused to help the people gather in small groups, and
True.
have refused to even allow that into their church culture. It's amazing.
Well, they lose control which is an important thing to some people. They lose control when it becomes centered not in the Sunday pulpit, but in the home fellowships. Those are difficult things here in the United States because we have good roads and we can drive 100 miles on a Sunday morning if we want to get to hear the preacher, the performance that we want to hear. And we lose something in terms of what it means to be serving where we are. Interesting thing, this group that I had been invited to be part of, they had a conference in Washington, D.C., and lo and behold, the chaplain of the Senate was going to be the speaker. And when he saw I was in the congregation, I introduced myself to him. He said, "Oh, no." He said, "I was going to preach your book."
Wow, that's awesome.
He said, "Now I can't do that." I said, "No, please do." He said, "No, I can't." So he was a great guy. I really loved him.
Wow, that's a neat story.
Yeah.
Well, in your own preface to the book, Jesus Style, Gayle, you wrote about a question that you often had wished you could ask God, which was, quote, "Why have you let your church get in such dismal shape with factions, fightings, and heresies?" And then you wrote, "I've come to an understanding of principle and purpose that has rescued me, and in my view has the potential of freeing the church to become what Jesus designed it to be." And so as I'm thinking about that statement you made, I'm thinking right now, here we are still in mid-COVID. This could be the best opportunity we've had in the church since the 60s and the 70s to allow Jesus to fundamentally and radically change the church into his image and what he wants the church to be and what he wants it to look like. What are your thoughts on that? What do you think?
I agree. And I tell pastors who have used well the internet and the things available so that they can preach to people anyway, even though they can't see them, and they discover they're preaching to thousands more than they ever had before. And I said, now you're going to lose this unless you decide, let's keep doing this. I'll teach you on occasion, but I want you to be in your homes and meet in your homes and pray for one another there. You know, that's the only place where you can hear and be heard, pray and be prayed for, is in small groups. I taught that at what is now Vanguard University, and it was so much fun because I had some upperclassmen who were in the religion program who were real mind trippers. And sometimes in universities, that's what happens. You lose contact because you're smarter than others. And this was a whole different thing. The class was where we did it. And I would start off by showing them how open I was willing to be. And we'd give our life story and then respond to each other. But we would also pray every week. And I said, finally, please, let's lay before the Lord the thing we really desperately want. And the next week you would be, these mind trippers would come bounding in. They had never believed that such and such would have happened in their lives, but they prayed for it last week. Mm-hmm. And I saw that over and over. I did a retreat for a church in the Washington, D.C. area. And it was young adults, and I do a lot of small group stuff, so I got in one because we were one short, and it was a married couple and about a 30-year-old young lady, maybe 33. And the married lady, I said, let's really lay it before the Lord now that we know each other and love each other. And she said, I believe God made me to be a mother, but the doctor says it's impossible for me to become a mother. Mm. But I want to pray. I said, it's not impossible with God.
Amen.
And the other young lady said, I'm the only Christian in my family, and they make fun of me. They won't even invite me to things because they don't want me there. She said, if just my mother would get saved, I'd be just so happy. And so we prayed for that. A year later, I'm back at the church. I hadn't forgotten it. I'd done it for that church, They wanted me to speak for them. And the guy that picked me up said, there's a couple of people that want to see you when you get here. I said, I don't know anybody here. Well, you'll find out. And the first one to show up was a lady with a baby that had been hurt, And the second one was this 30-year-old or some-year-old girl just bounding toward me and finally said, you're not going to believe this. I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
She said, not only did my mother get saved, but all of my sisters have gotten saved too, And I'm thinking, where else could you pray for that except in small groups where you learn to love each other and care for each other? One of the things that used to bother me when I was young is the pastor in a church would say, okay, let's have prayer requests. And I've noticed that they were always real small, surfacey stuff like pray for my split ends in my hair or my ingrown toenail. And then here is some people listening to this will really understand, I think. Then there would be this statement, are there any unspoken requests?
Right.
And every hand would go up. And I thought, oh my, that's where the needs really were, but they had to remain unspoken. And so in that smaller grouping, which maybe we're having a chance to discover again, miracles happen. They just do. I did a youth retreat for a church in Sacramento, California, that I broke them into small groups, and we did this. And I told them, look, really ask God for what you know you really want in this. You learn to trust each other. 6 months later, late at night, on Sunday night, I got a phone call from the youth pastor, and he said, we just did a survey of the things that we prayed for at the retreat. What has happened? And he said, every single thing for which we had prayed, God had done. And he said, I felt like I owed you a phone call to let you know this was what had happened.
Wow. That's awesome.
Well, this is the thing. It's just the church being the church.
Yeah, right. And the Father doing what Jesus promised he would do whenever
Absolutely.
2 or 3 agrees touching anything on earth.
Absolutely.
Wow. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's do it. Let's take this opportunity during COVID to change the focus and change the culture of our fellowships and allow this kind of thing to take place en masse.
Oh my! It's a golden opportunity built around this horrible pandemic.
Yeah, I agree. Well, at this time, we're going to be taking a brief break, and then we're going to resume our discussion with Gayle Erwin about the Jesus style for life and ministry. We'll be back soon.
You've been listening to Strength for Today's Pastor. Foyman Ministries appreciates your participation in prayers. If you'd like to help financially support this podcast, you can go to our website at foymanministries.com/donate. Thank you.
Okay, we're back. So, in writing the Jesus style, Gayle, there are many ways you could have approached the subject, but you decided to write about Jesus and his incarnation, his coming in human flesh. Quote, you said, I want to take his thundering power, compress it into the body that was his, place your hand against his skin, and if your mind can handle it, I know your spirit can, let you know that the touch and warmth you feel is God himself. So you point out that the disciples struggled with Jesus teaching about the kingdom like we struggle today. They jockeyed for position. They tried to argue about who was the greatest, all that kind of stuff.
Right down to the end.
Right down to the end. And then you quote that famous passage from Mark 10. It should be more famous in my heart, that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over each other, but it should not be that way among you. Whoever wants to be great should be servant of all. The Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many.
Absolutely. That staggers me. That staggered me for years.
Yeah. So why were the disciples so surprised with the Messiah when they discovered that he is actually different than the real thing? And what does that look like in pastoral ministry, this servant nature?
Well, I have known pastors who really were true servants, and they were genuinely in touch with their congregation. And from the pulpit, he wasn't telling people how they should be, because that's always putting them down. They're never there. But he's instead sharing how God has worked with himself and caused him to change in these various areas. So I hear it from time to time. I see it, but not very often, because there's just something about being a preacher that we think that it is more than servanthood. It's being impressive. But I think we preach well in our servanthood.
So that preaching style, that teaching style that uses the second person, singular or plural, a lot, that ought to be replaced with, this is what the Lord's doing in my life, or this is what he's speaking to us, that kind of thing. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think so. How to really do it in the systems that we currently have, because, every pastor wants a big crowd. And the way the crowd's going to be judging you on how well you preach, how well you move them. But the real thing is, how well do you example for them servanthood? And what does it mean to be in situations where people will really share with you and you can pray for each other? I'll tell you a little story. When I left the headquarters of the denomination I was in, I was there for 4 years and invented a whole new youth programming magazine for them that won all kinds of awards. But that's a whole nother story. But it gave me a real glimpse at how corrupt you get when you go higher. One person in there who had been in that building for most of that person's life came and put their head on my desk and wept and said, people think that the higher you go here, the more godly you are, but it's exact opposite. The higher you go, the more evil you are. I said, I've noticed that myself, but they laid their head on my desk and wept because they had not observed what they thought they would. At any rate, I was serving a church when I left there, and they wanted me to help them to be small groups because the pastor was in favor of that. But there was one guy who was really denominationally oriented, and he felt we better start all of these small groups ahead of time and before Gayle gets here, because I know a little bit about him and so forth. Well, they did, and what they did was they shrunk the congregation down into a smaller thing with a pulpit and pews, you might say, in the home, and they called that a small group. Oh. Well, when I got there about 4 months later, the first thing I said when I got up and introduced myself is, I want to announce that the small group program is finished as of now. They shouted. They clapped.
They like that.
And then they said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, just watch and see. And so two things I had, because I have a degree in counseling, they wanted me to deal with a lot of the problem people they had. And I found out, I can't do this just one-on-one. I've got to have the power. So I got those folks that I called my sickies at first, and God made me pay for that statement together. And we just became the church in a way. And so many incredible things happened with those people who before just couldn't even function. That husbands and wives that were not in the group wanted to now get in it because they saw what had happened to their spouse and the like. And then I proved that to the leaders in the church, a handful of them, bored and their wives. And that was so powerful that when I left, I had only started 2. But I came out to the West Coast to teach at Vanguard then. A year later, they understood there were 21 groups in that church.
Oh, that's exciting.
That had just grown off of that. And I thought, this is awesome. And that's the way it works.
Yeah. So the pastor's going to have to become vulnerable himself somehow.
Absolutely.
And it's going to have to be willing to relinquish power and not make what happens on Sunday morning the meat and potatoes of the church life.
Right. And all how good
things.
You preached. Oh, that was a great sermon.
Right, right. And then it's going to have to be willing to let this happen in small groups and let the Spirit do what He does through people.
I really believe that. And I've seen it. This is the thing. It's not like I'm talking possibilities. Yeah. I've seen it in its reality. And it's just, God loves to hear us genuinely pray. And when it says 2 or 3 shall agree as touching something, I think we don't understand that word agree. It's really harmonize, where we feel it is our problem too.
Yeah, one of our appointment pastors likes to say that, we as pastors need to give the people someone to love and opportunities to do it.
Right.
That's what's going to help the church be healthy. And
I like that.
Yeah, I do too. I think it's just really, and in my own experience, Gayle, that's, I was at a large church in Costa Mesa years ago. They said that at the time there were 10,000 tithing families, and then I went and joined a commune in Idaho for a while, but I discovered in the commune this kind of dynamic of fellowship, yes. Which is, and so I came back and I thought, I can't live without this.
Yeah.
This has got to be part. So we didn't know what we could do because there weren't that many opportunities in the church at that time for that. So we just, I was part of a group that we started our own, and that was helpful. But just discovering that life doesn't really happen as a Christian without having someone to love and doing that.
Absolutely. Well, he says, love one another as I have loved you. And he defined love, I think, as foot washing, you might say.
Yeah.
Which we don't understand that because we don't wash feet. And if a pastor says we're going to have a foot washing service on Wednesday night, 4 or 5 people show up with the cleanest feet they've had in decades.
Yeah. And then, in that John 13 story about foot washing, it just dawned on me one time, these were the leaders. These were the apostles.
That's right.
If they didn't learn how to do this with one another, if they didn't treat each other that way,
right,
then this Christian movement would just stop. It come to a grinding halt really quickly after Jesus went back to heaven.
Oh, yeah, and it would have, but it grew from house to house.
Yeah.
And out of the houses, missionaries went to other places.
Yeah.
It's just a powerful thing. And the thing about it is that it's not a threatening thing. You can grow from house to house, but you can't grow from big building to big building.
Yeah.
But from house to house, it works.
Right.
How else would you win New York City? Are you going to buy property there and build a big building?
Exactly. No. Exactly.
But wherever people are, there are houses. There are places to live. It may be a condominium or something, but there are houses.
Yeah. So appreciate this discussion, Gayle. Well, back to the Jesus style. It includes, as part of the book at the end, yes, you've done a great service, in my opinion, in putting together a tremendous application-rich study guide in the back of the book. And I love that it's not an informational study guide. It's designed to get into the heart of how we live and applying the nature of Jesus. It seems to me, Gayle, that it would make an amazing study guide for every pastor who wants to adjust his own heart and also adjust the culture within his team of leaders, and also for developing what the church culture is going to look like. So how would you suggest perhaps that a pastor might use the Jesus style as a discipleship or training tool to do that type of thing?
I guess when you're looking at the nature of Jesus and how he was totally others-centered, and that's something a lot of people don't really understand, and his willingness to be with people that others wouldn't be with. I mean, he was welcome. And in fact, the worst kind of people, the ones that were paid by Rome, they hated with a passion, and Jesus loved them. And how do you know he loved them? Well, I spend time with you, and I become your friend, and so forth. One of the things that I found that make people realize that is I listen to them and I give them my eyes. Children, adults never give children their eyes. And I had an interesting thing when I first went to Rhodesia then, and a missionary with his little son visited me. And on the way home, the boy said, "I like that guy." And he said, "Why?" And because he didn't understand why. And he said he finally found out it was because he looked at me. He gave me his eyes and listened to me. Mm. And as pastors, we want to be listened to, but the way we get that way is we listen to them and learn to let them talk. And the more they do, the better pastor you are.
In one of your books, I don't remember if it was the Jesus style or if it was the body style, but you talked about when you were an assistant pastor in a church and the women were having their meeting. And so you went to the church while the women were having their meeting, and you decided to go hang out in the nursery. And you showed up in the nursery and you said, "Hi, I'm Pastor Erwin," and there was no response. The children looked at you with their big bug eyes and
went on about their business.
And then you decided to change your tactic, and you got down on the floor and you said, "Let's play." And then within seconds, you had them all climbing on you and playing and having a great time. And you tied that in with the nature of Jesus and how he is so approachable that even children love to be around him. Just like you just said, making eye contact with the child automatically loves the adult who's doing that.
One little story, I, in the past, have done a lot of teaching for youth with a mission. And when I would teach in Hawaii, I would teach both the youth and the older folks that had families, and they would insist that I teach their children too. And I'd go in, I'd get on the floor with them, and I'd teach from that standpoint. And even their little babies, they wanted me to teach them, just the crawlers. And I'd get down and lay flat with my head cupped, and they'd do the same thing and look at me. And we'd talk to each other, and I'd tell them how God, I got to tell you this. I'll interrupt this. I have this strong feeling about communion that it really, we limit it to things that I don't think Jesus limited it to. And they'll say, if you're not a believer, let this cup pass. Well, he didn't say that. And we don't let children partake in it. And so a church in Hawaii, they let me get away with stuff. And I said, let me lead communion this morning. And I said, go get the children out of Sunday school. And they brought them in, and I let them come up front. And I said, now, if one of these is your child as a parent, I want you to come down and stand behind them. And I said to them, I hope you understand that you are God's favorite. He indicated that. Jesus said, you let the children come to me. In fact, he said, if we don't become like you, we're not going to make it. And you have every one of you, a special representative that reports to God on how we're treating you and the like. And so we want you parents to come and give your child communion. And if your parent's not here, I will do it. Well, there were no dry eyes in that house when it was through. And later I asked the pastor, I said, did I mess things up? He said, no way. He said, they won't let me have communion any other way but with the children there and with it being a community thing.
Wow.
And I believe that we've made it a ritual, and that's unfortunate.
Wonderful. I have a feeling there are going to be some communion services changing after this podcast is released. That's tremendous.
Oh, I told one pastor of a denominational church that I attend once in a while, because he had said, if you're not part of this and what have you, you don't participate. And I said, why do you say that? Jesus didn't say that.
Yeah.
I said, why don't you make it open for everybody? Because maybe at that point they'll make their decision.
Yeah.
And he changed it. I mean, that's the way he did it from then on. And he thanked me.
Yeah. Oh, it takes a lot of pressure off the pastor to have to do this weeding out before communion is served.
And a lot of pressure off of the people.
Yes.
It's a wonderful thing if they say, we don't care who you are, you're welcome here. We want you to if you're not a believer, that's okay.
Yeah.
But do what we do, think of Jesus while we're doing it.
Yeah. Well, Gayle, it's time to sort of wrap up the podcast episode, but I want to just give you an opportunity to just directly share whatever is on your heart related to the Jesus style or anything that's on your heart right now at this moment, the Spirit's giving you to speak as a word of encouragement to pastors.
Well, I would say to the pastors, be a real person and be genuine with your people. Don't think of them as candidates to come and be at the church, but think of yourself as a candidate to be a servant for them. Where are their needs and how can you meet them? What are they? And don't wait until they get to church to find that out. Go to where they are, to be with them. And in this day and age, it's kind of hard to do that, but still you can visit individuals and be that. And I think out of that will come more of a genuine church. And you'll want to do that from then on. I don't want a preacher just to preach at me because I'm going to judge his preaching. I don't think right. I could have handled that better than you did. But when he prays for me and listens and cares for me and others, I'm impressed.
Good word. Appreciate that. Love it. Well, appreciate again, Gayle, joining us in this podcast. You have made your resources available on the website servant.org.
Well, and I need to say that right now they're all free.
Wow.
Anybody that wants a copy of the Jesus Style or any of the books I still have, and I've ordered more Jesus Styles, in any quantity you want, call us, write to us. My email is Gayle, Gayle, at servant.org, and we'll get them out the next day.
Okay.
But they're free.
Yeah.
And we even pay the postage.
Wow. And then along with that, you've got the free downloads of the audio reading that you've done of all of your books. So an idea would be to play the audio reading of the book in a small group environment and have them each have their own hard copy of the book, and then go ahead and follow through the study guide and talk about it and pray for each other and just have a small group wonderful time together.
Yeah, the questions at the end, especially in this later editions, really work. I was in England, and the company Word handled it first, and so one of them over there said, we should get you to write all of our study guides.
Yeah, get it out of the theoretical and out of the propositional truth realm and into the practical.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Gayle, and may the Lord use this for His purposes. Amen?
Amen.
Amen.
Boy.
And thanks for joining us today in this podcast. And along with all the other Strength for Today podcasts, you can subscribe by Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, any other podcast outlet, or you can go to our website, poimanministries.com, to listen to this and to the other various podcasts on different subjects. So until next week, God bless you, and may the Lord strengthen you richly with Jesus in you, the hope of glory.
Strength for Today's Pastor is sponsored by Poiman Ministries. You can find us at poimanministries.com. That's spelled Poimen ministries.com. If something in today's program prompts a question or comment, or if you have a topic idea for a future episode, just shoot us an email at strongerpastors@gmail.com. That's strongerpastors@gmail.com. May the Lord bless you as you serve Him, His pastors, and His church.